about domain and range. Domain are all your x values. Range is all your y values. Domain is also called the inputs, and range are the outputs. Okay. So here's the example we talked about today. What are the domain and range of this function? This function over here. If you remember, these lines mean absolute value. Absolute value. So our graph will look like a V. Okay. So it does help to sketch the graph first to find the domain and range. So we have to write the domain and range in set builder notation and interval notation. So if you remember from the last review unit, there was an absolute value in your notes. In absolute value, we find our A, find our H and K to find our vertex, which is HK. So remember, if there's no number in front, it will always be a 1. So my A is 1. That's my A. My H is the one inside the absolute value, which is positive 8. Remember, if it's minus, it's going to be the opposite sign. This is only for finding HK. When you're solving for X or Y, for example, if I had a negative 8, this will change into a positive 8. If I had a 8, this will change into a positive 8 still. But if we're finding for HK, so if I had X plus 8, my H value will be negative 8. So don't confuse that. Okay, so my K, since there's no plus K here, we will have plus 0, which is my K. So my vertex will be 8, 0. So now let's graph that. Since A is positive, it's going to open up. So let's go ahead and graph our equation, which is right here. So to find a domain, we have to scan from left to right. So I'm going to start from my left to right. So my domain are all my X values. So I see that I already reached my first point. If the arrow is pointing to the left, if there is ever an arrow, that means it's going forever. Okay? Which in our terms goes into infinity. But it's going to the left, so everything to the left will be negative infinity. And on the right, we see that there's also an arrow pointing to the right, and it's going forever. So the right side will be positive infinity. Okay. Positive infinity. So this is interval notation. Now let's write it in set builder notation. That would look like X negative infinity less than X less than infinity. They're both less than because remember, in infinity it's always going to be a parentheses. And I'm using X because my domain are my x values. So next up we have our range. So for range, we are going to scan from down up. So we're going to scan down up. So I'm going to start at the bottom over here, looking at my y values. So now I'm about to reach my first point. Okay. Now what is my first y value? It will be at y equals 0. Y equals 0. So I am including it. So it's a bracket because it's a solid dot. Solid dot. Okay, so for example, if my starting point was right here and it doesn't have a dot, but it doesn't have a hole either, then that means it's also a bracket. So since my range keeps going up forever, you see it's also pointing up here. It's also pointing up, the arrows are pointing up. So it's going forever, so that means my range will be all the way up to 0 to infinity. In set builder notation, that would be x, and it's going to be x, it's going to be 0. It's going to be 0 less than or equal to, it's not x, I meant y, because range are all your y values. So y, 0 less than or equal to y less than infinity. Okay, so this will be your answer. I'm using y because range are all my y values. Okay. If you have any questions, please leave it in the comment. All right, let's go on. So you guys did this today, the example. So in this case, my AHK, my A is 1, my H is -5. Remember, x minus -5, so that's my H. My K is -3. So my vertex is -5, -3. So now this, my domain, so it's going to keep going forever. Again, will be -infinity to +infinity. My range will be where my graph starts from bottom up. So here is -3. So I will include it, -3, all the way up to infinity. Okay, so talked about this. If there is a squared, it's a shape like parabola. And we also talked about x and y intercept. Y intercept, it's where the graph intersect the y-axis. X-intercept is where the graph intersect the x-axis. Okay, so to find the y-intercept, x equals 0. Find the x-intercept, y equals 0. Right. So let's do an example here. What are the x and y intercepts? For this one, we have that x-intercept is 0. So, so the y-coordinate of an x-intercept is 0, so we make y equals 0. That's why we plugged in right here, 0 for y. So we have then 0 equals absolute value x minus 3. Then we add 3 on both sides. This becomes 0, and it goes 3 equals absolute value of x. So both 3 and negative 3 are 3 units away from 0, so they have an absolute value of 3. So the answers will be x equals 3 and x equals negative 3. So this means, so absolute value really means that how far away is it from 0? Okay, so if the absolute value is 3, let me change that. So if the absolute value is 3, so how far away is it from 0? So if our answer was negative 3 and 3, how far away is negative 3 from 0? 1, 2, 3. 3 far away, so how far is 3 from 0? 1, 2, 3. So that's why the absolute value will be 3 for both negative 3 and 3. So the x-intercepts are also called zeros of the function because they are the input values that result in the function output value of 0. So basically, these are the zeros of the function. These are the zeros of the function. It crosses the x-axis. Crosses the x-axis. So these are the zeros. Okay, if you have any questions, let me know in the comment section. Okay. So now we're finding the y-intercept. For the y-intercept, we plug in x equals 0. That's why we plugged in x equals 0. So 0 minus 3. Y equals negative 3. Therefore, our y-intercept is 0, negative 3. So same thing as always. So this will be the graph. So these are zeros of the function because it crosses the x-axis. Crosses the x-axis. So this is an example for you. Okay. This is the graph. So what are the x and y intercepts of this graph? So let's find the x-intercept. To do that, we have to make y equals 0. So we have 0 equals absolute value of x plus 2. Let's isolate the variable. We subtract 2 on both sides. Negative 2 equals absolute value of x. Now, is this possible? Ask yourself, is this possible? Are there any values of x where the answer is negative? So, impossible. No such thing. Remember, absolute value, answers must always be positive. Therefore, there are no x-intercepts. See our graph here? It does not touch the x-axis at all. Okay, now let's find the y-intercept. Let's find the y-intercept. Let's find the y-intercept. It's x equals 0, y equals absolute value of 0 plus 2, so y equals 2. Y-intercept is 0, 2. And there it is. All right, if you have any questions, let me know again.